Fractale is a rare kind of anime in that it's an anime where its media narrative is a lot more interesting than the show itself. And what do I mean by that? I mean that Fractale itself, God, I wouldn't call it a particularly bad anime, but I wouldn't call it a particularly good one either. Like, I'm guessing that there's a pretty good chance that you either haven't heard of this anime at all, or that this is the first time you've heard anyone so much as mention it in years. And yeah, that doesn't shock me at all. While it has a few fans out there, for the most part, this anime was met with a resounding meh upon its release. So then, if it's so unmemorable, then why am I talking about it? What do I mean when I say that this is an anime with a media narrative more interesting than the show itself? Well, I mean that while the show itself was largely forgettable, the headlines it was making were anything but. Like, if you were even sort of following anime news in the early months of 2011, it would have been harder not to hear about Fractale at least a few times, or at the very least, jokes about how its director was gonna save anime. Yeah, obviously I'll explain it in detail in just a moment, but its director pretty much staked his career on this anime doing well because he was just so confident that it was going to revolutionize anime as we know it. And that did not end up happening. That extremely did not end up happening, and it didn't happen so hard that it even became a meme to use it as a metric to measure the success, or lack thereof, for other anime releases. Yeah, if this sounds pretty wild, it's because it is. Let me tell you all about it. Our story begins in the mid and late 2000s, specifically with the success of series like Canon 2006, Lucky Star, and K-On! The aesthetic and overall vibe of these anime and others like them was generally referred to as moe. My god, there's a word I haven't heard in 50 years. And people tended to have strong opinions about it, which is to say that for the most part, people either loved or hated moe. Enter anime director Yutaka Yamamoto, aka Yamakan, who had been working at KyoAni up until 2007. His credits from his time there include, but aren't limited to, being an episode director for Air, Fullmetal Panic Fumofu and the Second Raid, and Canon 2006, and series production director for the first season of The Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya. He made his full directorial debut with Lucky Star, but after only 4 episodes, he was abruptly removed from the position because, for reasons that, as far as I can see, he's never fully clarified, he was fired. The official statement essentially stated that he just wasn't at the level that they needed him to be at, so yeah, the specifics of what happened still remain vague. But anyways, yeah, no longer with KyoAni, Yamakan founded a small new studio called Ordet. And Ordet saw decent success in its early years. In 2008, they were credited for having done production assistance for Kanagi, which was animated by A1 but directed by Yamakan, and in 2010, they made the Black Rock Shooter OVA. Anyways, it was around this time that Yamakan developed some pretty difficult feelings about moe that can only generously be described as not 100% positive. More specifically, what he seemed to particularly dislike wasn't so much moe itself as it was the growing fan culture surrounding moe and its perceived fracturing of the anime community. His thoughts on the matter seem best captured in a 2009 interview for the Otaku Encyclopedia, which is apparently a book that exists. But anyways, in this 2009 interview, he said about moe,
"I say I make moe anime because it's convenient, but I have no idea what moe is. I can't deny that some characters are moe, but if we try and define those elements, we end up creating separate camps of fans that cut themselves off from one another. I'm not criticizing moe anime, and it's fine if moe elements are there, but making it on purpose and categorizing it isn't good. Anime as anime is just fine, so we should leave it that way."
Yeah, and in case any of that's a little too subtle for you, here's something else he said later in the same interview.
"As a creator, I have a responsibility to change anime. We need to stop categorizing, suppress the tendency to cut ourselves off from others in the community, and liberate anime and bring it to the masses. If we don't, then we will continue to retreat into smaller groups, watching more specialized anime until we perish.
Yeah, does that sound a little melodramatic to you? Yeah, maybe even a little unhinged? Good, it should, because it is. Years later, he would recall that KyoAni specifically gave him the chills, and that it made him realize that he lost his place in the anime industry. But he also felt like he absolutely had to return to it. Ultimately, these conflicting emotions resulted in his directing Fractale. Yeah, formally announced in August 2010, although whispers and vague news about it had been circulating for some time by that point, at first glance, Fractale seemed like an interesting project. Made by A1 and Ordet, this original sci-fi anime would be on the Noitamina block, which, in case you don't know what that is, it's a Japanese programming block which has featured plenty of fantastic anime, and the main trio working on it would be Yamakan himself, of course, prolific screenwriter Mari Okada, and Japanese culture critic and scholar Hiroki Azuma, who were going to be the director, series composer, and story developer respectively. Yeah, it was definitely the kind of announcement that people took notice of and were excited about right off the bat, sure, but also getting a lot of attention was a certain blog post on Fractale's official site, one written by Yamakan, and in true Yamakan fashion, yeah, it's, you know what? No, I'll just let you go ahead and hear it for yourself.
The subject of anime has troubled me a great deal. It's been quite a while, in all honesty, more than a year at least. Despite that, I've still stuck in and dabbled with anime when possible. I talk about anime whenever I could, involve myself where I could. The more it came up, the more I'd think about it. And the more I thought about it, the darker my thoughts would get. It began to cloud my daily life. I'd be lying if I said I hadn't thought things like, maybe anime's just not the way to go. Many times, though I always kept it to myself. The only thing stopping me from giving up entirely was the unease, the guilty conscience eating at me alongside those thoughts. Wouldn't quitting and writing off the whole medium be unfair to the anime that's brought me to the point I'm at right now? That's the kind of thinking I've had recently. But maybe it's just a guise for my stubborn nature. I think I'm ready to go out in vain. I think I'm prepared to sacrifice myself for no real reason. That's why I'm going to try my hand at one last show. I think that this is an ultimate gamble for me, in the truest sense of the term. If this project fails, then I won't hesitate. I'm done. I'll retire. I'm mentally prepared for that. That's why I'm writing this statement. But despite that personal resignation, despite accepting it, I still want to tell you something. There's something I need to convey to you, something I can't quite put into words. It's a little thing inside of me that screams, I'm not done yet. You could probably call it faith. I've grabbed tight to that little fragment of faith, and I'm going to use as much of it as I can to work on this anime. I don't know how things are going to turn out, but I have to hope. I can only dream of a future where anime truly shines, and I hope to be a part of it. I'll see you all when Fractale begins.
And just like that, the word was out. If Fractale failed, Yamakan would retire. Now, I know that nowadays he's since developed a bit of a reputation for doing this sort of thing somewhat regularly, but in 2010, he had never done this before, so this was kind of a big deal. The ante was up, and nobody really knew if his confidence was well earned or if he was about to have a massive egg on his face. Speaking of which, yeah, so where did Yamakan's boundless confidence for Fractale's success come from anyways? What made him so convinced that it was going to be successful that he was willing to effectively gamble his career on it? Well, in addition to the obvious things like, you know, the names attached to the series, that it would be on the Noitamina block, and the positive reception that the announcement got, I think a lot of it can be seen in an Asahi article from early January 2011, not long before Fractale actually started airing. It's a piece on on Yamakan's pessimism toward the then current state of the anime industry, and there's a lot to unpack in this piece, but if I sit here and dissect the whole thing, we'll be here all day. Really, I think the only thing you need to take from this article, for the sake of this video at least, is that Yamakan believed that the anime industry at the time was in a very introverted state, but that Fractale would be different because rather than try to appeal to diehard anime fans, it would instead target non-anime fans or former anime fans who've kind of fallen out of the hobby, presumably due to the rise of moe. Yeah. That was it. That was the secret ingredient. That seems to be a large part of why he believed Fractale would be so successful. Because it wouldn't bank on appealing to otaku or otaku culture. Because it would be, well, not like other anime. Yeah, do you remember that interview with the Otaku Encyclopedia that I mentioned earlier? Toward the end, he talks about an anime that he's working on that'll be out in 2010, and given how his involvement with Black Rock Shooter was pretty limited, he's just credited as a supervisor, and how he mentions that this project will have an original story, I think he's referring to Fractale here. And he says about this mystery project that's probably Fractale,
I want it to be a work that overthrows the moe anime Yamamoto Yutaka image. There will be no more dancing in my anime.
So, yeah, you wouldn't be totally off the mark if you said that the way he talks about the anime industry, and moe especially, it really makes it sound like he wanted Fractale to be a sort of anti-moe statement, and whether or not it succeeded in being that, well, let's not get too ahead of ourselves. Instead, for now, I want to talk about the statement that Fractale would become much more well-known for making, at least in the West, and that's its failed, albeit explosive, one about piracy. Yeah, let's go ahead and fast forward a bit to the actual airing of Fractale. In 2011, official simulcasts were still a relatively new thing. The first few happened in 2008, but it wasn't until 2009 and 2010 that we started seeing them happen more regularly. The overwhelming majority of these official simulcasts were being done through Crunchyroll, but by winter 2011, Funimation had been starting to rack up a decent amount of experience too. So the news that they'd be simulcasting Fractale, which many were already highly anticipating since Yamakan had spoken so boldly about it, wasn't necessarily a surprise, since in 2010 Funimation had signed an agreement with Fuji TV that would allow them to simulcast the Noitamina shows, but it was an announcement that was nonetheless met with quite a bit of intrigue. And yet, it was not nearly as much intrigue as the update that everyone received about a week later, that after only one episode, the Fractale Production Committee, aka the FPC, demanded that Funimation's simulcast be halted until Funimation did away with all the pirated streams and downloads of the first episode on the internet. And let me make sure that's clear, because I am fully aware of just how ridiculous that sounds, but against all odds, that really was what was being asked of Funimation, to get rid of all the pirated versions of Fractale on the internet. All of them. As if that was a thing they could just do. As if they hadn't been struggling against piracy themselves for years. But apparently that didn't matter. Yeah, per the ANN piece on this, according to Funimation representatives, the committee requested that Funimation eliminates unauthorized videos of the anime on the internet, including streaming sites, file sharing networks, and file servers, before its simulcast will be allowed to continue. As a result, there will not be a simulcast of the second Fractale episode tomorrow, and the rest of the series' simulcast is on indefinite hold. In response to the slightly less absurd idea that the FPC might have just been referring to illegal streams and uploads of that first episode of Fractale, specifically with the Funimation subs, ANN's late executive editor Zach Birchie even further clarified in the thread about this news,
"Boy, you'd think that, wouldn't you? But nope, we clarified with Funimation on this, they mean everything."
The public response to this news was more or less exactly what you'd expect. You know, a lot of confusion, a lot of disappointment, a lot of people pointing out that all this was gonna do was force people who still wanted to watch it to pirate the show, and plenty of opinions about piracy overall. Funimation's then marketing director, Lance Haskell, even chimed in briefly with a couple of posts in the ANN thread about it, and a Funimation blog post about territory rights. Nonetheless, regardless of their opinions on piracy, people were, for the most part, just thinking that the FPC was making an absurd request. And making things even more absurd was that the FPC confirmed the next day that they'd still allow the French simulcast to continue, which wasn't just hypocritical, but also still gave pirates access to high-quality rips of the episodes to use. But after a few more days of limbo and the airing of episode 2, it was announced on the 24th that Funimation could resume its simulcast, that the second episode would come out that very day, which was a Monday, and that episode 3 and all other future episodes would be out on Thursdays. Funimation issued a statement basically saying that on behalf of the FPC, they've been taking the appropriate legal action toward the online illegal distribution of Fractale, and that seemed to be that. To this very day, the specifics of what went on behind the scenes and why the FPC wanted to do this in the first place still aren't clear. I even tried reaching out to Lance to learn more about this whole thing, but alas, he seems to have completely forgotten about it. To me, personally, this whole thing sounds like a flashy but misguided effort to reduce piracy, which was made and approved by people who didn't really get how the internet worked, but this is just speculation, and the facts remain obscure. That being said, it's unclear whether or not these are connected to the FPC's request, not least of all because these don't center around Fractale, but it's still worth noting that on the same day that it was announced that the simulcast was resuming, that Funimation and an anti-piracy service sent a DMCA copyright complaint to Google over links to pirated episodes of One Piece appearing in search results. And then on the 25th, the literal day after the announcement that the Funimation simulcast was resuming, Funimation announced their plan to sue 1,337 BitTorrent users for pirating episode 481 of One Piece. Yeah, spoiler alert, ultimately, this lawsuit did not work out. Again, it's unclear as to whether or not the FPC's request had any influence over these decisions, but nonetheless, the timing of these relative to all this Fractale stuff still definitely raised the collective eyebrow of everyone who'd been keeping tabs on it. But anyways, after this all blew over, well, later there would be one more unexpected delay in Fractale's simulcast, though surprisingly, it wasn't because of the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, which happened close to the end of Fractale's airing. No, instead the delay would end up being because of icy roads and rolling power outages in the Dallas-Fort Worth area that kept Funimation's headquarters closed for 3 days. Nonetheless, Fractale eventually ended in April of 2011, but just because the series itself ended doesn't mean that the drama ended with it. Do you remember what I said earlier about Yamakan saying that he'd retire if this anime didn't do well? Yeah, let's talk about how that worked out for him. I want to take you back to that Otaku Encyclopedia interview with Yamakan for just a moment. In particular, I want to remind you of this little quote. As a creator, I have a responsibility to change anime. Like we already discussed, it's hard to hear Yamakan talk about his views of the anime industry at the time and not feel like he wanted Fractale to be a sort of anti-moe statement, and I think it's the combination of these ideas that Yamakan seemed to feel a level of personal responsibility to change anime, and his resentment toward moe's effects on the anime industry and the viewers, that resulted in the spreading of the, honestly not entirely far-fetched idea that Yamakan thought Fractale was gonna save anime. Hence the meme, Yamakan is gonna save anime. So then, did he do it? Did Yamakan save anime? Well, you know what? Let's go ahead and take a look at Fractal's sales numbers. For most anime DVD and Blu-ray releases in the late 2000s and early 2010s, to sell over 10,000 copies in the first week of release was usually considered a signifier of an incredibly successful release, but to sell a few thousands of copies was still considered pretty respectable. The first volume of Fractal, however, which was released in Japan on April 22nd, 2011, sold an absolutely pitiful, downright embarrassing 883 copies during its release week, making it easily the worst-selling first volume of an anime from its season. It was so pitiful, in fact, that it became a bit of a meme to use it as a metric for measuring the success of other anime. But while the rest of Fractal's sales, or rather their lack thereof, wouldn't achieve meme status, they still weren't particularly better. You know, Volume 2 was the best-selling of the bunch at 888 copies, and then its sales took a sharp decline for Volumes 3 and 4, which sold 528 and 519 copies respectively. And while DVD and Blu-ray sales definitely aren't a definitive metric for success, I think it's safe to say that they're pretty important to take into consideration when you, oh god, I don't know, gamble your career on the show in question being successful. So then, was Yamakan gonna follow through? Was he really gonna retire?
Oh, hell no! Hell no, hell no.
Like I mentioned earlier in the video, his effectively gambling his retirement on Fractal's success became a big talking point among anime fans pretty much right off the bat. And in fact, shortly after he made that statement, his blog was reportedly closed so he could take responsibility for making a reckless announcement of his immediate retirement, provoked by an anonymous inflammatory comment on the blog. He was harshly reprimanded by Noitamina producers Isoda and Shimizu and has withdrawn his retirement. But of course, this didn't stop people from joking around about it, and certainly not from asking about it either. Just over a week after Fractal finished up, the cover of a new issue of Otona Anime magazine said, "Finally, Yamakan talks about Fractal." And, well, you can probably imagine how it worked out.
I thought to myself about how I'm part of this industry, so I need to at least watch some of what's being broadcast from it these days. I turn on the TV and watch whatever production happened to be on at the time, and honestly, I'd sit there, staring at it with no idea what the hell was going on. I thought to myself, have I gone nuts? Then I wondered if the world itself had just gone nuts instead. One thing was clear in either case. My values didn't line up with whatever the hell was the norm on the screen these days, and I wasn't sure how to bridge that gap. Fractale came out and it just wasn't appreciated enough for what it is, so that puts me at a total loss. I have no idea what to do going forwards. I honestly have no clue. I'm seriously thinking I should just retire for a while. I'd appreciate it if you included this. You can fly the retiring part as a headliner or something if you want. I'd rather you did that, since otherwise I don't know if I'd be able to calm down about it.
Am I so out of touch? No, it's the children who are wrong.
So, what of the million-dollar question then? Did Yamakan actually retire? No, he did not. Despite everything, he would start vague posting about a new project again as soon as November of that year, effectively cementing that he was indeed not actually retiring. And as a little side note, by the way, just to give you a little bit of perspective on what people thought about this, I want to read you the last bit from the Crunchyroll news piece about this. It says, "Does the prospect of a new project from Yamakan leave you intrigued? Or did Fractal leave enough of a bad taste in your mouth as it did mine to wish he had took his own advice and leave anime for good?" So yeah, in so many words, the legacy of Fractal is not exactly a great one. In doing the research for this video, it quickly became obvious that people who remembered anything about Fractal at all, which is already kind of a feat in and of itself, usually remembered more about the memes and weirdness surrounding Fractal than Fractal itself. Though to be honest, I think that has less to do with the anime itself as it does Yamakan and his absolute nonsense, both at the time and in later years. For the most part, reviews and scores for Fractale tend to be pretty lukewarm. Like, as of when I'm writing this script, its average score on my anime list is 6.95, on IMDb 6.9, but then on Anime News Network it's 7.4-ish, and on AniList it's nice. And as for Yamakan, he was then and has continued to be an extremely divisive figure within the anime industry, and that's wording it very, very generously. But if I sit here and fully detail what I mean when I say this, we'd be here all day. So for the sake of getting this video wrapped up, here's just a brief and, I cannot emphasize this enough, non-exhaustive highlight reel of what he's been up to since Fractale. But yeah, to get this wrapped up, that is Fractale. That is the unforgettable story of the peculiar battles of an otherwise extremely forgettable anime. I can't really think of anything else to say about all this, so, God, I don't know. If you haven't already watched it, then you should go watch Madoka.
I can only dream of a future where anime truly shines.